It may come as no surprise to you that one of the topics I find endlessly fascinating is the concept of higher dimensions of space, and in particular, wondering what four-dimensional shapes might look like. I've got a bunch of videos on the topic and an entire book too. But in talking about higher dimensions on the internet, I've come to realize that that phrase means a lot of different things to different people. I've been tagged in videos about paranormal phenomena, claiming that something I've said in one of my videos proves the existence of ghosts. But I've never wanted to say anything more than this is a fun geometry puzzle. Studying higher dimensions is actually a legit mathematical pursuit, and honestly sounds really awesome to do as a job. People with such jobs might work at universities doing research or in a variety of industries. Dimensions pop up in so many different fields, including neuroscience, AI, statistics, cybersecurity, quantum mechanics, topology, algebra, physics, cosmology, and even dressmaking. So I spoke with three people whose jobs involve higher dimensions to find out how they use them and what they think about some of the stranger interpretations.
I'm Aidan Sims. I'm a mathematician who works on, I guess I would describe it as quantum mathematics. So the way that that operates is that when you're modeling a quantum system, for every variable that you have to model, you need a different dimension. So if you're modeling arbitrarily complex systems, you need arbitrarily many dimensions. And so I work on how you transform spaces of arbitrarily large dimension, basically.
The thing that I do study are four-dimensional spaces. As you know, in mathematics, there's like a sort of division between pure maths and applied maths. And I'm in pure maths, and we just sort of study these objects and shapes without necessarily thinking about whether they exist or what they're useful for. And we're just sort of, to us, it's sort of like a fun puzzle, and we're trying to figure out what could possibly be the properties of shapes like this.
So in statistics, we think of high-dimensional data, and we think of the case where, because we're able to collect so much data about everything around us nowadays, that basically every piece of information you collect is basically a new dimension. And so it's the idea of how you take very large dimensional data that we're collecting and sort of understand what this sort of lower dimensional thing is. So it's truly underlying our data.
These three experts are all mathematicians, but in three very different fields, and I was surprised to see just how different their use cases for dimensions were, across quantum mechanics, knot theory, and statistics. When you say spaces, are you talking about like spatial dimensions, like forwards and backwards?
Yeah, so this is interesting. It is like spatial dimensions, forwards and backwards, but the spaces that I'm talking about are not the space that we see around us. So the space that we see around us is arguably either three-dimensional or four-dimensional, depending on whether you count time. But the mathematical model that describes quantum systems involves, the spaces are a mathematical construction that models how the quantum mechanics works.
Is the space you're describing now what's known as Hilbert space?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So Hilbert space is a higher, well, it doesn't have to be higher dimensional, but it's a space of arbitrary dimension where there's a notion of angle, so we can still make sense of what things are at right angles to each other. That's what distinguishes a Hilbert space.
If someone's talking about Hilbert space and using it mathematically, is it useful at all to think of it geometrically? I guess like asking yourself, what is this infinite dimensional shape I'm working with? Does that sort of come up?
It does a lot, and it's quite interesting because a lot of the starting point of Hilbert spaces is figuring out exactly which of the things we picture when we think of three dimensions still work no matter how many dimensions there are, and which ones you have to be careful about and instead use the formal mathematics to understand what's going on. Yeah, so it is very helpful, even though the space may have 20 or 100 or infinitely many dimensions, it's useful to picture it like three dimensions.
There's no way for you to draw an interesting sphere in 3 dimensions without having it hit itself, intersecting
we
itself.
can't not a sphere in 3 dimensions.
Exactly. And the codimension is very important because 3 minus 2 is 1, and that's not enough, basically. But 4 minus 2, well, that's 2. And so it turns out that you can take a 2-dimensional sphere and knot it in 4-dimensional space. So that's the sort of thing that I study.
So one word I've heard that might relate to what you're saying there is the phrase dimensional reduction. What on earth is that?
So it's the idea that we have a very large amount of data, but again, we're only interested in a very sort of small subset of that. Okay, we may have, for example, a very basic example, we may have like a 3D world here, but actually our data lies on the surface of a piece of paper, and then maybe sort of bend and sort of distort that paper in sort of funny ways, but it still really only lives in 2 dimensions, even though it's in a 3-dimensional space. Here we're sort of thinking on a much larger scale, so we have a million dimensions, but really our data lives in maybe 100 dimensions, or maybe sort of much, much lower. So reducing these very large things down to just 2 or 3 dimensions where we can have some sort of human intuitive understanding is a big step.
So far, this was sounding pretty theoretical, but behind some of this research were larger applications in building technology or other interdisciplinary projects. Some of these ideas do leave the research paper and impact the world we experience daily.
The idea is you have a bunch of computers that are nodes, and you sort of draw sort of links between them if they communicate and they share information. You have these sort of rings and sort of patterns that appear, and it's when these sort of rings and patterns disappear, this can be evidence of a cyber attack. So maybe an intruder's come to your system and suddenly is pinging lots of messages around to all the computers it can find, and that sort of breaks all the other structure that you would see in your network. So you're using these sort of shapes to try to spot, and when they sort of appear and disappear, as evidence of something's either going anomalously wrong in your network. So these are the sort of ideas that we're trying to use in sort of cybersecurity.
Say, let's take something topical, so quantum computers. Right. So if I want a quantum computer that has just 2 bits, so in a normal computer that wouldn't be enough to do much, but just as a starting point. So in a quantum computer you have qubits, and they have 2 possible states. They could be a 0 or they could be a 1, and each of those states has to be modeled by an orthogonal dimension, like another dimension in the underlying abstract space. So even to model 2 qubits, they've each got 2 dimensions, so that's 4 dimensions. So just for the most basic quantum computer, you already need more dimensions than we can picture.
Now, just because something might have practical applications doesn't mean that it always has to. Maths doesn't need to be motivated by commercial applications, and most mathematicians I know are really motivated by the joy of puzzle solving and the magic of discovery.
One of the things I really love about topology, and this is something I learned a lot later, is that it brings mathematics into concepts that I'd never really thought of as mathematics before. And so, for example, when I think of something like knot theory, which I do study, it just blows my mind that you can use mathematics to study if 2 knots are different. As a child, if someone had told that to me, I probably wouldn't even believe them. I study 4-dimensional spaces, so they're not that concrete. But I study them using my intuition, and I think about them very geometrically. And that appeals to me more than, like, I've spent some amount of time, working with equations and inequalities and so forth, and those things can be very precise, and I like that aspect. But to be able to draw pictures and just sort of, my preferred type of mathematics is when you move things around with your bare hands. I do feel like my job is, I solve puzzles all day. And I think having these very visual problems really brings a sense of play into it in some sense, where you really feel like, as a child, you moved blocks around, and that's really what I'm doing. They're 4D blocks, but they're exactly.
To understand why the maths of higher dimensions is relevant to so many topics, it's useful to know that the word dimension doesn't always refer to space, and really any parameter can be considered a dimension.
Actually, a friend of mine who makes her own clothes, she had a very nice analogy of this. So she was talking about if she has a pattern for a dress she's making, it has some number of measurements that you have to make. And then the set of numbers that corresponds to, your dress or my dress or someone else's dress, like that collection of data or potential data, that forms some dimensional space. So maybe you have a simple dress that has just 4 measurements, or a really complicated one that has 12. So, that really complicated dress, that's a point in a 12-dimensional space, versus the simple one is a point in a 4-dimensional space. Maybe another example that's, closer to mathematics in some sense, would be to think about like a matrix. Suppose you have a 2x2 matrix. And so if I just think of a single matrix, it has 4 numbers in it, let's say 4 real numbers, and that's just a single item. But you could try to think about, well, what are the other matrices that are close to this one? And you can imagine, all right, if I just keep all 4 of them more or less the same and just slightly change each number by just a little bit, that's like a matrix that's close to my original one. But I have 4 different coordinates that I get to change, and I get to change them independently of each other, right? And so if I now think about the set of 2 by 2 matrices, if I just think of it as a set, that's like just thinking about infinitely many discrete points that are not necessarily arranged in any way. What is it that makes something a space rather than just a set? Well, to me as a topologist, the thing that distinguishes those 2 items, those 2 types of objects, is this notion of closeness. So I get to decide, like, okay, 2 matrices are close, or they have distance, whatever, if all of the, I could like add up the differences between all of the numbers or something, or I could take the square root of the sums of the squares, or whatever notion of distance you might like. And so that additional notion of like closeness is what would make the set of matrices, 2 by 2 matrices, into a space.
Okay.
And then 2 by 2 matrices, that's something that, we've been thinking about for a long time. And that is, in fact, a 4-dimensional space. Not one that you necessarily live in, unless you're a 2 by 2 matrix, I guess.
In my videos, I often talk about specific shapes, like a tesseract, which is a 4-dimensional cube. And some of you have commented and asked, what's the point of this? Or wondered if it has any use beyond being a mind teaser. Has thinking about a tesseract or understanding one ever been useful to you?
Okay, so yes, I can think of a specific instance where I was doing some research, and a tesseract was exactly something that I needed to be able to describe. The research really had nothing to do with shapes or geometry. It was actually to do with combinatorics. It was just trying to count how many ways I could build a system of a certain type. But the mental picture or the mental model that helped me to do the counting was a tesseract.
So it was nice to know that thinking about 4D shapes can sometimes be mathematically relevant. I also wanted to broach the topic of the paranormal. I wondered if these experts were ever troubled by the way that people sometimes talk about higher dimensions and the use of mathematical vocabulary to support spiritual claims.
I love the richness of language. And it's a feature of all languages, and particularly English, that the same word means different things in different contexts all the time. And we use a word because it conveys the right sort of notion to us or something, or so I guess I think that mathematicians use the word dimension in a very technical sense, and that's fine because that's what we're doing with it. And for us, it really is just a way of counting how many different variables are independent from each other a lot of the time. And that's the way that we're using the word dimension. If you watch, I don't know, Avengers, they're using the word dimension when they talk about multiverses and different dimensions in a completely different sense. And I can see where it's a good way to indicate that it's not something that we can see. It's something completely, orthogonal to the way that we, experience the universe or whatever. I think it's just a matter of, like all English words, it's being used differently, and that's fine. And I guess for a mathematician, we spend a lot of our time giving very, very precise mathematical definitions to words that already exist to help us to communicate to each other effectively and efficiently. So I guess I can't really object to other people also taking a word and giving it the meaning that helps them to think about what they're working on. So yeah.
To me, dimensions really do mean like a degree of freedom. As a pure scientist, we aren't really thinking about what these notions correspond to in the real world, if anything. The most general thing that I could do, there's something there. And then someone else could come and think about, all right, well, this is actually a good model for something else. And then now, because I've done this background work, your life is a little bit easier because you can just use what I've figured out for you, but then specialize it in your own realm. And so, right, space-time seems like a 4-dimensional thing. That's wonderful. I'm not really thinking about it. There is, people may well think about the 4th dimension as some sort of spiritual, otherworldly thing, but that's for me in the notion of like, what does it mean in the real world? That's not what I'm doing at all. It's very interesting. what I'm doing. Yeah.
I loved their perspectives, and I feel like I did get a better sense for how mathematicians really think about the fourth dimension. Everyone I spoke to had a confidence that comes with thinking about these abstract ideas every day. They weren't intimidated by them, and instead showed how embracing the rather simple foundations can lead to a lifelong curiosity.
You talked about in one of your videos being able to take something out of a safe. Like there's a safe and it's locked in 2 dimensions, but if you're a 3-dimensional creature, you can just pick it up out of the safe and somebody in the 2-dimensional universe couldn't see it. A lot of what we do is really exactly what you did in that video, where we say, well, let's just imagine that all of these dimensions are really just 2 dimensions. And then what could we do in the 3rd dimension? And we're still restricted to, we can only picture 3 dimensions as well. And really a lot of being a mathematician is learning what things you have to be careful about that might not be quite the same when you do that analogy, and where you have to just go to the formal mathematics instead.
I'm glad to know that my video has some grounding in what mathematicians are thinking about as well.
Yep.
Thanks for watching this video, and thanks to my Patreon supporters for making it possible. A special shout out to today's Patreon cats of the day, Hermes and Apollo.